People in every age are willing to believe the absurd if many others believe it too. In the mid-19th century, when the world was just beginning to believe that reason would save humanity, Charles Mackay wrote a book that went against that pride: Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds*. It's a work that not only chronicles the history of financial fevers, but also serves as a spiritual map of humanity losing itself amidst the collective. The book tells of periods when entire societies simultaneously believed in nonsense. The French believed paper money could create gold, the British believed patriotism could guarantee profit, and the Dutch believed that a fragile flower bulb could be exchanged for an entire fortune. They weren't foolish, they were simply swayed by consensus when the crowd grew large enough. Error then takes the shape of truth. What keeps this book alive after nearly 2 centuries is not the numbers or economic events, but how it exposes the mechanism of collective belief. When an idea is repeated long enough, when it carries the flavor of desire and fear, it becomes a religion, and people, regardless of education or status, are willing to kneel before the altar of illusion. The question is no longer why people of old were so foolish, but whether people today are truly different from them, as modern crowds gather around financial markets, social media, or technological trends. Are we sure these aren't new versions of Mississippi, South Sea, or Tulipmania? Mackay might not just be writing about the past, but about the present itself, where every click, every share adds another ripple to the ocean of delusion. And in that world, the awakened one is not necessarily smarter, but simply the one who dares to stop amidst the running crowd. The madness of crowds doesn't ask who is right or wrong, it merely holds a mirror to humanity and whispers, "Are you sure you are awake?" From the dawn of time, humanity has always believed itself to be a creature of reason. But history, like a dim mirror, keeps repeating a single image: frenzied crowds, chasing delusions like a flock of sheep running towards the edge of a cliff. We have witnessed thousands of times mental epidemics sweeping through humanity, things unseen by the eye, yet destroying all wisdom, turning reason to ashes. The purpose of this book is not to preach or judge, it merely wants to gather the most irrational moments in history. Those times when humans willingly abandoned sobriety to plunge into the vortex of delusion. These moral epidemics, as I call them, are not transmitted through the air but through belief. They spread from one person to millions with just an idea, a rumor, a dream of gold, or an exhilaration for paradise. When a belief becomes a fever, people are willing to do what reason once condemned. I realize that people don't just imitate each other in good deeds, they also imitate in madness, in error, and even in crime. One person believes a prophecy, 10 follow. And soon enough, an entire nation kneels before an illusion. The crowd can turn a word into truth, a schemer into a savior, a gamble into destiny. And when that imitation reaches its peak, it is no longer consensus, but a contagion of the mind. People often like to believe they are in control of everything, but the truth is they are often led by the very things they think they understand best. A nation can become insane with the idea that war will bring glory. A city can sell its soul, believing that metal will turn into gold. A generation can kill each other just for fear of a ghost they themselves imagined. These mental epidemics don't need medicine to spread, only hope and fear. I do not write to mock. I write as a witness, having passed through countless collective infatuations and realizing a terrifying law. The reason of an individual is strong, but the reason of the crowd is tragically weak. When standing amidst a crowd, people are no longer themselves. They become elements of a giant beast that can roar for a false belief and crush anyone who dares to doubt it. Those once called enlightened kings, scholars, merchants have more than once been the first to sow the seeds of madness. A prophet declares the end of the world, and tens of thousands sell their homes and abandon their fields, standing on mountains waiting for a brilliant light. A financier promises that worthless paper will turn into gold, and an entire country throws its wealth into his hands with faith as strong as believing in God. Every era has its own epidemic. Only the names change, the essence does not. I want to expose how people repeat mistakes in different forms. Today they invest in a fictional company, tomorrow they worship a prophet, and the year after they burn witches to dispel their own fears. All are different manifestations of the same illness, the delusion that the crowd cannot be wrong. If some century someone were to rewrite the history of madness, it would surely require hundreds of books like this. Each period has its own fever, when people no longer live to understand, but to imitate. I merely contribute a small chapter to the endless epic of delusion. Perhaps many will find these stories familiar, because every madness is ultimately the same, differing only in costume and language. But in those seemingly ancient details, I believe there is still enough novelty to make people shudder when they realize they too are living in another madness, only more sophisticated, more modern. The madness I describe is not limited to finance or faith. It also lies in seemingly small things: unconscious mimicry, self-satisfaction, blind belief in consensus. At times, I wanted to believe that knowledge and time had cured humanity of this disease. But then I looked around and saw them still arguing over unreal things, still chasing illusions, still believing that the crowd is surely right. I once thought that if someone were patient enough to write the complete history of collective illusions, they would probably need 500 volumes. Each page would tell a story of human self-deception. And each story, no matter where it began, would end with the same conclusion: awakening comes too late. Humans can conquer nature, explore the universe, create AI that can think and calculate, but they still haven't learned how to recognize when they themselves are going mad. Reason is like a flickering lamp in a storm, shining for a brief moment then extinguished by the wind from the crowd. And when that lamp goes out, the world begins a new cycle of delusion, where those who claim to be rational are often the most enthusiastically insane. When we look back at history, we see a peculiar thing. Humans can recognize the madness of previous generations, but are blind to the madness of their own era. They ridicule those who once feared ghosts, believed in alchemy, or meaningless prophecies. Yet they themselves rush into new fevers, differing only in name and form. Self-confidence makes them think they are progressing, while in reality they are merely circling within the labyrinth of their own minds. I chose to record these insane stories not to mock the past, but to illuminate the present. Because in every collective illusion, we can hear the breath of our own time. When people believe that a piece of paper can turn into gold, or that one person can change the destiny of a nation, the difference between intelligence and foolishness is merely a thin line. The crowd has such a powerful imagination that it can create an entire parallel world where all absurdities become truths. They build castles with belief, mint money from illusions, and worship those who know how to say what they want to hear. One day, when everything collapses, they don't realize they've been deceived, but instead curse others for daring to break their shared dream. Among countless insanities, I will recount stories of money, where reason and ambition meet to create tragedy. There, the smartest are often the ones who lose the most, because understanding cannot protect people from greed, just as fear cannot stop them from rushing into a fire when they see a faint gleam of gold inside. I found a sadly common denominator in the financial fevers of the past century, from France, England, to Holland. Every bubble begins with a good idea. People want to enrich their country, stimulate trade, usher in an era of prosperity. But when that belief meets greed, it turns into a flood that sweeps everything away. Just as fire is created for warmth, but uncontrolled, it burns down the whole house. I call it the hysteria in solemn attire. On the outside, it wears the name of development and ideals, but inside it's the same old disease. The desire for quick profit, the belief that the crowd cannot be wrong, and the illusion that this time it's different. The great speculations in history, the Mississippi scheme in France, the South Sea bubble in England, or Chillipmania in Holland are just different ways of telling the same story. The story of humans forgetting that true value cannot be multiplied from nothing. To be fair, not every madness is contemptible. There have been times when illusion became the fuel for creativity. People needed to believe in the absurd to dare to do the extraordinary. But between creativity and madness, there is only a thin line, and history shows that humans rarely stop before that boundary. They cross it, plunge into the abyss, and only when they hit rock bottom do they realize it was not the sky. I once thought of writing specifically about religious madness, periods when faith was pushed to extremes, causing people to kill in the name of God. But I stopped, not out of fear, but because there were too many, too horrific, enough to fill dozens of books. I want to dedicate this volume to the seemingly milder, but no less devastating, infatuations, the madness for money. Because it is what everyone thinks they understand best, but in truth are most easily deceived by. I chose 3 typical stories, 3 plays where the audience is all of humanity. One about a man named John Law, who made an entire nation of France lose its reason over paper called money. 2 about the gentlemen of England, intoxicated by the South Sea Company, where promises became commodities and greed became religion. 3 about the Dutch flower growers who turned a tulip bulb into a symbol of elegant delusion. These 3 stories differ in location, but share a common soul: greed disguised as idealism. People say every era has its own gilded illusions, but I believe what's more terrifying is that they are always reborn under new names. When a crowd believes in something strongly enough, they can turn wrong into right, a lie into a promise of salvation. And when that dream collapses, they seek another illusion to replace it, like an addict switching drugs but never stopping the addiction. Humanity is infatuated with its own ghosts, and the more advanced it becomes, the wiser and harder to identify those ghosts become. I cannot cure this disease with stories, but I can shine a light on it so that those who are still sober realize where the true light lies. The rest, as always, will continue to chase illusions until they themselves become a part of the history we are reading today. History not only records the actions of individuals, but also the moments when an entire nation collectively lost its mind. There, the boundary between sanity and delusion vanishes, and what was once considered madness suddenly becomes a sacred duty. When a collective frenzy erupts, no one dares to question reason alone. Reason is always the weakest amidst the cheers of the crowd. Each century has its own kind of madness, but the root cause remains unchanged: the desire to transcend one's own limits. People can go mad for faith, for honor, for victory, or for money. One century, millions left their homes to go to Jerusalem, believing they were fighting for the soul of humanity. Another century, the very same Europe, went mad with fear of devils and sent hundreds of thousands of innocents to the stake, believing they were saving the world from evil. There were periods when intellectuals and saints alike believed that stone could turn into gold and that a small glass vial contained the secret of immortality. They called it alchemy, a belief that lasted hundreds of years, wearing down countless intellects for an unreal dream. Yet to them, it wasn't madness. They were simply living in the dream of their era, dreams celebrated, funded, taught as truth. But not every delusion is beautiful. There were eras when murder became a legalized pastime in Italy, France, Spain. Poisoning an enemy with sophisticated toxins was considered an art. Noblewomen with rings adorning their hands stirred sparkling substances into wine glasses, smiling as their opponents fell. The entire society, from servants to kings, knew, remained silent, and considered it normal. When evil is accepted long enough, it becomes a lifestyle. At times, madness took the name of military glory. A nation, from king to commoner, was mesmerized by the sound of war trumpets. They believed that blood was a necessary offering for honor. Young men eagerly went to battle, mothers bid farewell to their sons with proud tears, and those in power reveled because patriotism had deified them. But when the gunfire ceased, the fields were left with only graves and dry grass. They called it victory, though deep down they knew it was just a delusion painted with the red of blood. There were also times when madness wore the cloak of morality. People believed that personal honor had to be cleansed with blood, and so, a glance, a word was enough to make 2 men draw swords. They called it chivalry, a symbol of courage. But if observed closely, one would only see the fear of being ridiculed, scorned, seen as weak. That madness, no matter how beautiful the name it was called, was still slavery to the gaze of others. And perhaps the oldest disease humanity has yet to cure is the belief in omens and prophecies. No matter how far science progresses, there will still be those who believe their destiny is written in the stars. In 17th century Europe, no monarch made an important decision without consulting an astrologer. A child born at the hour of a comet, a strange dream, or the howl of a dog late at nightfall could make an entire court change its mind. These things didn't just happen in the distant past. They still exist, only changing form. People are still mad. The only difference is they are mad in brightly lit buildings, in modern attire with more sophisticated tools. Sometimes they no longer believe in gods but in numbers, in markets, in the advice of those who claim to know more. And they gather, cheer, throw money, sweat, believing they are doing the right thing. In every age, people seek something to believe in, but belief without sobriety always turns into a frenzy. A solitary person can be wrong, but a wrong crowd creates disaster. No power is greater than a crowd believing a lie. They can pull down thrones, burn cities, or erect idols from mud. And when the frenzy subsides, when ashes cover the ruins, they say it was only the fault of the times, not their own. The scary thing is not that madness comes, but how humans forget that it once came. They repeat every mistake, only changing the tune and color. Today they chant a new slogan, tomorrow they will rewrite history, and the day after they will fall into another vortex. They always think they are awake, but in reality, they are only dreaming within another dream. Humans are not born to be mad, but they love madness as they love a dream. It makes them feel great, makes them dissolve into something larger than themselves, and thus nations will continue to go mad, again and again, until they learn to love the solitude of reason more than the fervor of the crowd. Humans have a strange instinct. They fear the truth but are enchanted by falsehoods. Truth is always dry and cold, demanding that people look directly at their limits, while illusion is softer, sweeter, knowing how to say what the heart wants to hear. And so, through the centuries, humanity still chooses to believe in dreams, even though those dreams have killed them countless times. I have seen that pattern repeat in every age. When crowds gather, they become powerful, but at the same time, they lose the ability to distinguish truth from falsehood, right from wrong. They will cheer for those who promise, not for those who warn. They will stone those who dare to doubt and crown those who speak the words they like. In the thick air of excitement, reason is stifled like a candle in a gale. People think in herds, they go mad in herds, but only awaken one by one. I wrote that not as a philosophy, but as a profound sadness, because awakening, when it comes, is always too late. When the crowd retreats, only isolated individuals are left sitting amidst the ruins, wondering how they ever believed such a thing. They awaken not through learning, but because the illusion has nothing left to nourish it. The collective madness ends when the pain of each individual becomes deep enough. The recovery of reason never comes all at once. There is no trumpet call to signal that humanity has awakened. One person realizes before another is still intoxicated. Some are so sober that they are lonely, forced to silently watch their friends follow the parade of illusion, knowing they cannot pull them back. And there are also those who, after awakening, miss the frenzy, because in it they once felt they belonged to something greater than themselves. I once thought, are humans born to repeat the same mistake, only changing attire and words? The madness of the 17th century took the form of religion, that of the 18th century took the form of gold and silver, and that of the 20th century wore the cloak of technology and progress. But the essence remains the same. Crowds seek miracles, and the clever know how to sell them. In my years traveling through cities, I realized a terrifying truth. Truth never wins by its own strength. It only exists because illusion has died on its own. A truthful word can echo through a crowd, but they will not hear. Only when the cheering stops, when the dream collapses, when purses are empty, when belief turns to ashes, do they return to seek the truth and call it experience. As for those who warned, they are forgotten or ridiculed as pessimists. Collective madness not only destroys property, but also distorts the soul. It makes people forget their self-respect, encourages them to lie, to pretend to believe in order to belong to the majority. And when everyone pretends to believe, the lie becomes reality. At that moment, honesty is no longer a virtue but a sin. I have seen the smartest people succumb to the allure of the crowd. They are not foolish, they simply cannot endure loneliness. Nothing is more frightening than being right alone amidst millions of wrongs. The solitude of reason makes many choose to return to the crowd, choosing to be mad with everyone rather than sober alone. Thus, every time an illusion collapses, the world loses another layer of people who once knew how to doubt. I have no illusion that humanity will change after reading these pages. Mental epidemics will return, only in different guises. There will be new prophets, new financiers, manipulators of faith using more modern language. And then those who once laughed at the past will repeat it, only this time they will have technology to amplify the madness faster. I write not to cure, but to remember, because memory is the only thing that prevents us from repeating mistakes. Although I know people will forget, I still want to preserve this here, as a small reminder that truth may fade, but it never disappears. It lies in the silence, in the gaze of those who have awakened from the frenzy and understood that the crowd is merely a wave, while reason, however small, is an unmoving stone. If humanity could learn one thing, it is that illusion is always more alluring than truth, but only truth can save them. And as long as they prefer promises to warnings and cheers to silence, these pages will never be old, because each generation will rewrite it with their own lives. Every financial tragedy begins with an illusion cloaked in reason. France, after the reign of Louis XIV, was exhausted. The treasury was empty, public trust shattered. In that moment, a strange man named John Law, a tall Scot with bright, frighteningly intelligent eyes, appeared. He believed that money was not gold or silver, but belief. If people could be made to believe in the value of paper, France would become rich without needing any more metal. Law was the son of a wealthy banker in Edinburgh. From a young age, he learned to understand the language of money. But his life took a turn after a duel over love forced him to flee England, drifting across the continent. He relentlessly studied currency, the power of credit, and the circulation of capital. He understood that circulation, not hoarding, was the soul of economics. That idea, bold and dangerous, was the first spark for one of history's most insane fevers in Paris. The Duke of Orleans, then regent of France, was desperately seeking to save the national treasury. He was captivated by Law's promise. Simply by changing how people viewed money, the nation's destiny could be changed. So Law was invited to court, allowed to open a bank called the Banque Royale, issuing banknotes redeemable for gold. Within months, trust spread like wildfire. Paper money was widely accepted, prices rose. People believed a new era of prosperity was coming. But Law didn't stop there. He wanted to create a bigger dream. Mississippi, a distant land in Louisiana rumored to be full of gold, silver, and treasures. His company, the Company of the West, was granted a monopoly to exploit and trade there. The first shares were issued, and in the eyes of Parisians, they sparkled brighter than diamonds. People said that merely investing in Mississippi could make one a millionaire. From nobles and priests to servants, all plunged into the frenzy. Paris transformed into a giant stage of greed and illusion. At the Hotel de Soissons, where the company's headquarters were located, thousands lined up daily to meet Law and buy shares. Those who once despised him now bowed and begged. Noblewomen used every trick to get on the shareholder list. Some pretended to faint in the street, others staged carriage accidents just to make him stop. Law became a monetary deity, and shares were a magic charm that could make any dream come true. Rue Quincampoix, once quiet, now became the center of the speculative whirlwind. Brokers yelled prices amidst the crowd. Sellers hawked shares like bread. Money changed hands so fast that no one remembered what they were buying. Small houses nearby increased tenfold in value within days. People rented rooms just for trading, hired people to hold their spots, paid soldiers to guard their money bags. The crowd was chaotic but euphoric. The rich grew richer. The poor believed their luck had turned. In taverns, they boasted about their Mississippi shares as if speaking of dream treasures. Stories of golden cities in the New World spread through every corner of Paris. Everyone believed they were about to be among the first to set foot in the promised land. Law walked through this storm of belief with the calm demeanor of one who understood the power he held. He didn't shout or seek glory, just quietly orchestrated the wheel of illusion. He understood that the value of money existed only as long as people believed. Thus, every action, every word of his was calculated to reinforce that belief. Then Paris began to suffocate. Rue Quincampoix was too narrow to hold everyone. People set up tents, opened eateries, hired singers to perform in the street to keep customers. This was no longer a street but a fair of greed. All rules of morality, class, and dignity blurred. Nobles sat beside merchants, clerics jostled with prostitutes, only one religion was worshipped: money. The Duke of Orleans, seeing the scene, was half pleased, half fearful. The treasury was saved, but society was going mad. To curb it, he ordered the entire stock exchange moved from the narrow street to the larger Hotel de Soissons garden. Hundreds of wooden tents quickly sprang up there, becoming a giant tent city where shares were bought and sold day and night. The French capital turned into a legalized casino of hope. Law became the center of all eyes. His every step made share prices fluctuate. A nod from him could make the crowd cheer, a frown made them tremble. He was hailed as the man who created gold from paper. But within him, a growing worry had begun, for he knew that belief was the most fragile thing in the world. As night fell, Paris still glowed with torchlight. People still cheered, signed papers, exchanged money, dreamed of riches. But beneath that surface, a faint crack echoed. The crack of belief stretched to its very limit. The mornings in Paris became unusual, no longer marked by church bells for mass, but by the roar of crowds jostling to buy Mississippi shares. On every street, people discussed prices, profits, and dreams of wealth. A beggar yesterday could become a millionaire today, and vice versa. All were caught in the ceaseless whirl of illusion. Rue Quincampoix was now like the heart of the entire nation. Small houses were packed with people inside, some standing jammed, some climbing on tables, some arguing to buy. Shouts and laughter mingled with cries. In one room, two people argued over a share. By the time they reached the door, both had forgotten their dispute and shook hands to invest in another project together. The entire city seemed to be playing a mad game of chess that no one would stop. That chaos worried the government. Paris became stifling. Crime increased, with thefts and frauds occurring everywhere. The Duke of Orleans ordered the closure of Rue Quincampoix, moving the entire stock exchange to the larger, walled and gated Hotel de Soissons Garden. There, hundreds of wooden tents were erected, each a small bank where shares changed hands in seconds. Food vendors, drink sellers, even fortune-tellers flocked there, forming a miniature city living on the breath of money. In that garden, everything was valued in Mississippi shares. Houses, carriages, goods, jewelry, all could be exchanged for paper. People brought their entire fortunes, inheritances, grandmother's gems, or mother's wedding rings to invest. They believed that in just a few weeks, those fragile pieces of paper would multiply tenfold, 100-fold. And indeed, for a short time, France seemed to have been reborn. Streets bustled, restaurants stayed open all night, the poor found work, the rich grew richer. John Law was revered like a saint. Wherever he went, guards protected him, and carriages cleared his path. Noblewomen waited for hours just to see him, believing that his gaze alone could bring good fortune. But in that brilliant light, shadows had begun to creep in. Share prices rose to a point where no one knew what their true value was anymore. Someone would sell all their assets to buy shares, then sell them again after a few hours upon hearing new rumors. All of Paris lived on rumors. A whisper from a stranger could make hundreds of people change their investment direction. A casual remark in a tavern could make share prices jump. To maintain the upward momentum, Law began to merge the Bank Royale with the Mississippi Company. He wanted to create a colossal system where all transactions, all debts, all payments would pass through his hands. Paper money was printed more, circulated more, but the gold in the treasury did not increase. When people began to realize this, confidence, the foundation of the entire dream, began to crack. Parisians who had once hailed Law now whispered among themselves whether those papers were still good for anything. Some quietly went to the bank to exchange for gold. Long queues began to appear. Law reassured, promised, printed more money to keep the flow going. But the line of people demanding gold grew longer every day. As faith in paper money wavered, his entire castle began to tilt. In desperation, the government issued an order. All large transactions must be made with paper, not gold. The purpose was to force the populace to trust the new money. But the order only made panic spread faster. The wealthy sought to move their assets abroad. The poor sold everything for real money. Some burned banknotes right in the street, crying and laughing, as if bidding farewell to a dream. Law, once called the creator of gold, now became a prisoner of the very magic he had conjured. He understood that one could not fight the crowd when they lost faith. To save the situation, he launched a bizarre plan. He selected 6,000 homeless people, criminals and paupers, put them on ships to Louisiana, the rumored paradise, to mine gold, aiming to prove to the populace that Mississippi truly had value. But when the ships arrived, there was no gold, only swamps and mosquitoes. The news returned to Paris. Within days, everything collapsed. Share prices plummeted. People jostled and fought for gold. Banks closed. The streets were filled with screams and gunshots. Those who had once hailed Law now cursed at him. Noblewomen who had once pretended to faint to meet him now hid in shame. On his last night, Law quietly left Paris, stripped of glory, carrying only a few papers and sadness. The city that had once celebrated him was now silent, leaving only abandoned tents and banknotes fluttering in the wind like dead butterflies. But before leaving, he left a chilling yet profound remark. "I gave them money, but they only wanted miracles." And indeed, when faith is built on illusion, every miracle comes with a price. As France was just waking from the Mississippi nightmare, across the English Channel, England began to dream the same dream. People who thought themselves wiser than their neighbors unwittingly rewrote the tragedy with the same pen: greed. It was 1711, and the British government was deeply in debt after years of war. At that time, a group of merchants, nobles, and politicians conceived an idea deemed miraculous: to convert the entire national debt into shares of a company. In return, the company would receive a monopoly on trade with South America. They named it the South Sea Company. The idea sounded reasonable and noble. If the state granted a monopoly to a strong enterprise, solving public debt while expanding trade, everyone would benefit. But hidden within was a dream inflated by imagination. People believed that the South American seas were an endless treasure trove, where gold and silver lay piled high, and merely opening the doors would bring wealth. No one questioned whether Spain, the owner of those lands, would allow the English to trade freely. The truth was that the South Sea Company's monopoly was merely a vague agreement with Spain, allowing one single shipment per year to its colonies, along with the right to trade slaves for 30 years. But instead of telling the truth, the founders painted it as a gateway to American gold and silver. Newspapers, members of parliament, the nobility, even the king contributed to fanning the fever. The company's shares were quickly sought after like precious artifacts. The atmosphere in London suddenly mirrored Paris a few years prior. On Change Alley, people jostled to buy and sell shares. From merchants and priests to sailors, everyone wanted to become an investor. Those who didn't understand what the company actually did still poured money in, simply because everyone else was buying. The crowd believed that if France had had its Mississippi, England too must have its own miracle. The company's leaders promised incredible things. They declared that share prices would rise forever, that England would become the greatest trading center in the world. These lies were wrapped in the language of progress and patriotism. Investing in South Sea is investing in the homeland, they said, and so people believed not because they were foolish, but because they wanted to believe they were doing something great. By May 1720, the fever reached its peak. Share prices soared from PS 100 to PS 500, then to PS 1000 in just a few months. It was said that a noblewoman exchanged all her heirloom jewelry to buy more shares, while a retired soldier became a millionaire in just 1 week. London at that time was like a painting of madness, sketched with money. Small copycat companies sprang up everywhere. Some founded a company to extract salt from the moon. Some sold shares in a company seeking to turn lead into gold. There was even one brazen fellow who posted advertisements promising to open a company with a grand but undisclosed purpose, and still collected thousands of pounds in just a few hours. The crowd didn't need reasons, just an opportunity to dream. The aristocracy did not stand aloof. MPs, royalty, even the Prime Minister invested, both to profit and to appear patriotic. South Sea became a symbol of national trust. Anyone who doubted it would be branded a traitor. And when trust was clad in self-esteem, no one dared to speak the truth. In coffee houses, people discussed share prices as if talking about the weather. On the exchange floor, the crowd cheered every time the price increased by a number. Newspapers reported stories of the poor becoming rich, of families changing fortunes overnight. Trust swelled like a wind-filled sail. No one realized the ship was hurtling straight into a storm. By August, the price peaked at PS 1,000 per share. Those who had earned tens of thousands now dreamed of millions. South Sea was no longer a company but a religion. Whoever owned shares seemed to hold faith in England's future. But in the shadows, the company directors quietly sold off their own shares. They knew the fever had peaked, and all dreams would fall when no one was foolish enough to buy further. Bit by bit, signs of collapse appeared. Some couldn't find buyers. Prices began to stagnate. Rumors spread that the company was in trouble. Banks no longer had enough gold to redeem for those withdrawing money. The crowd that had once cheered for rising prices now began to jostle to escape. Those in the know saw a dark prospect, but no one dared to speak, for speaking meant inviting enmity. A writer penned, "Nothing is more dangerous than being sober amidst madness." And indeed, London was going mad, intoxicated by the illusion that miracles could be bought and sold on the exchange. As the summer sun set over the narrow streets of Change Alley, people still stood there, sweat mingling with the smell of paper and metal. A seemingly prosperous world, yet one that, with a single breath of doubt, would collapse like a sandcastle. England's delusion was reaching its peak, and after the peak, there was only a relentless downhill slide. All dreams end in silence, and so did the South Sea dream. As the cheers of the crowd gradually faded, only the hoarse cries of those who realized they had lost everything remained. In the early days of June 1720, share prices began to fluctuate like a giant stumbling on soft ground. From PS 890, it fell to PS 640, then was pulled back up to PS 750 with reassurances and promises. But panic had seeped into every corner of London. People flocked to banks, trying to exchange shares for real money. And the longer that line grew, the shorter trust became. In luxurious boardrooms, directors who had confidently declared themselves saviors of British finance now sat pale-faced. They had sold their own shares when prices were high, while outside, tens of thousands were still lost in the frenzy. Those who had once been hailed as heroes now became symbols of betrayal. By August, bad news spread everywhere. Small companies that had piggybacked on Southsea began to collapse. The company that turned lead into gold, the company that expanded Arctic trade, the company that extracted air, all vanished like smoke. Shares once sold for hundreds of pounds were now unwanted, even for kindling. Change Alley, once bright with hope, was now filled with torn papers and pale faces. It was said that in just a few weeks, tens of thousands of families lost everything. Some nobles who had sat in Parliament now had to hide from debt. Some wealthy wives became widows of the living. Some who were merely servants but had touched fortunes worth millions were now back to sweeping, poorer than before. London became a graveyard of burned-out dreams. On September 8th, a meeting at Mercer's Hall took place. The room was packed, the atmosphere thick as before a thunderstorm. The South Sea directors stood before the angry crowd, trying to keep their voices calm. They promised to restore order, stabilize the market, and return confidence to investors. But no one believed those words anymore. One person shouted, "You sold our dreams to buy us?" The entire room shook. The truth didn't need proof. It was present in the eyes of those who had lost everything. Then, like a domino effect, everything collapsed. Shares fell to PS 200, then PS 100, then no one even wanted to mention them. Banks went bankrupt. Thousands committed suicide. Farewell letters were found in coat pockets on desks by the Thames. The press called it the harvest of despair. The authorities tried to cover their tracks, blaming each other, hunting down those who had profited in the ruins. People found strange things: globe permits, small pieces of paper printed with a globe and a red wax seal, once traded as miraculous shares. Now they were just worthless paper. A satirical poet wrote, "The globe is green, oh let it fade." Glory was erased. Those who had once called themselves merchants of the future now wandered like ghosts in the streets. But amidst the chaos, a small voice echoed that of Jonathan Swift, who had seen through the delusion beforehand. He wrote with bitterness, "Change Alley is the South Sea, where men fish for gold but only drown in it." And indeed, tens of thousands drowned, not in water, but in their own greed. After the disaster, Parliament launched an investigation. Numerous MPs and officials were exposed for accepting bribes, insider trading, and price manipulation. Some had their assets confiscated, others were expelled from Parliament. But justice, even when it came late, could not save those who had been ruined. Trust in the state, in commerce, in humanity all were crushed. When everything settled, the English realized they had followed the exact same path the French had taken. Two nations, two civilizations, two languages sharing the same disease, believing that greed could be justified by reason. They had once laughed at the naivety of John Law and the Parisians, but ultimately repeated the mistake in the very same fashion, only in more opulent attire. The South Sea madness not only destroyed fortunes, it also left a spiritual scar. People began to doubt every dream, to fear every opportunity. The once bustling coffee houses were now quiet. Speeches about national glory disappeared from newspapers. Only a silent question remained in every heart: why do we always believe in things that bring us suffering? As night fell over London by the Thames, one could hear the wind whistling through closed windows. It was the sigh of a city just awakening from its gold fever. And though everyone promised never to let it happen again, everyone knew, given enough time, the delusion would return in another guise, with a new name. and people would believe again. When winds from the east brought a strange flower called tulip, meaning turban, to Europe, no one imagined that one day it would drive an entire nation to madness. Tulips came from Turkey. Western aristocracy regarded them as a symbol of luxury and knowledge. Conrad Gessner, an erudite scholar in Zurich, was the first to document the flower in 1559. He recounted that the first bulbs were sent from Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, to the garden of a nobleman fascinated by rare plants. At that time, it was simply a gift of nature. No one knew it would become the spark for one of the most bizarre financial fevers in human history. Holland, a land of pragmatic and thrifty people, was quickly enchanted. From aristocratic gardens, Tulipmania spread to the city of Amsterdam, where commerce and beauty met in the same breath. Initially, only scholars like Carolus Clusius or Philip Angeles collected tulips for their unique shapes and colors. But soon, this refined hobby transcended the realm of knowledge, becoming a sign of status and sophistication. Whoever had a rare tulip garden was revered as someone who understood beauty and was also wealthy enough to afford it. Then, beauty was gradually valued in money. Each tulip bulb was exchanged like gold and silver. People talked about it at parties, in coffee houses, on merchant ships. Some abandoned their professions, some sold their homes to collect the rarest bulbs. In Haarlem, a merchant paid half his fortune just to keep a tulip bulb in his greenhouse, not to resell, but just to show off to friends. When pride and greed walked hand in hand, beauty turned into an asset. The irony was that tulips had no fragrance, no lasting vitality, and were even less vibrant than many other species. But it was this very fragility that made them a symbol of luxurious beauty, delicate and elusive. A poet wrote that the tulip, arrogant and proud, lived only to be admired. And indeed, the Dutch, renowned for their caution, began to lose their reason before this fragile appearance. Flower growers said that when cared for too meticulously, tulips became weaker. The more splendid they were, the more easily they died. A terrifying metaphor for human society itself. The more we adorn artificial beauty, the more we lose our natural vitality. But at that time, no one paid attention to those warnings. The colors of the tulip blurred the reason of an entire nation. From aristocratic gardens, the craze spread to the merchant class, then to artisans, even the poor. People believed that just owning a single tulip bulb would change their lives. The flower bulb became a ticket into a world of fame and riches. Holland, a country built on reason and labor, was now entering an era where people believed in flowers more than in their own work. Auctions began to appear, where people debated the value of each variety of flower as if discussing real estate. "A semper Augustus," one person shouted, so beautiful that even the king would bid. And the crowd believed it. Thus, an imaginary economy was born, not based on goods but on the illusion of beauty. In that atmosphere, gardens filled with tulips were like dazzling colored lights in the night. Everyone wanted to touch the dream of purple, red, and yellow blooming before their eyes. But no one saw that behind each petal was a fragile thread tied tightly to the heart of the infatuated. A single gust of wind would be enough to shatter it. And then, quietly, the seed of that madness took deep root in the heart of Dutch society. No one knew how big it would grow. No one thought that just a few years later, those flower bulbs lying quietly in the soil would become the cause for an entire nation to kneel before its own delusion. When spring arrived, the first tulips bloomed, and with them, a new belief blossomed in people's hearts. Flowers were not just for looking at. Flowers could turn into gold. Beauty was no longer an enjoyment, but a means to acquire wealth. A flower once symbolizing elegance now became a speculative whirlwind sweeping across Holland. In towns like Haarlem or Rotterdam, bizarre negotiations took place every night in taverns. People no longer discussed politics or maritime affairs, but debated the price of a viceroy or a semper Augustus tulip bulba single bulb that could be exchanged for a carriage, 3 cows, or a house along an Amsterdam canal. The wealthy bought tulips as if buying honor, while the poor saw them as a lottery ticket to change their lives. The price of each variety was meticulously recorded like a precious metal price list. An Admiral Liefken sold for 4,400 florins, an Admiral van der Eyck for 1,260 florins, a General of Generals for 3,000 florins, and the pinnacle was Semper Augustus, a rare red and white striped bulb, priced at 5,500 florins equivalent to a luxurious house in the center of Amsterdam. In a country where a skilled craftsman earned only a few hundred florins a year, those numbers made all reason melt away. Flower growers began to divide tulip bulbs into small fractions, much like people divide shares. They called the unit per part smaller than a grain of wheat so that everyone could participate in speculation. An economy of flowers grew, not based on sweat but on promises. Handwritten contracts were signed between people who had never met, just to commit to payment when the flowers bloomed. From merchants to artisans, everyone became a tulip expert. Classes were open to teach how to distinguish petal shades, naming each variety after generals, admirals, nobles, as if each bulb was a national symbol. Tulip paintings were displayed in shops, and price records were read aloud every morning at the market, like the first stock reports in history. A story spread throughout the region. A man in Enkhuizen sold all his assets, bought 3 rare tulip bulbs, and told his wife, "We don't need a dowry anymore, just flowers." Another mortgaged his house to bet on an unbloomed bulb. When asked why he dared such a risk, he simply replied, "Whoever doesn't buy today will regret it for life." The tulip craze had become the religion of greed. The more people participated, the higher the prices rose, and the higher they rose, the more people rushed in. On winter evenings, in taverns across the land, people gathered to finalize deals, exchanging promises, hopes, and even beliefs. Some placed bets with barrels of beer, others with fur coats. All believed that in a few weeks, when the flowers bloomed, they would be 10 times richer. The once quiet streets of Holland now echoed with the laughter of tulip intoxication. Simple flower growers became millionaires overnight, while nobles who had once scorned merchants now jostled to buy rare bulbs. A child growing up in that era would have thought that tulips were real money, that everything in life could be exchanged for flowers. But amidst that noisy madness, small voices still echoed. Some scholars warned that nothing stable could be built on fragile petals. They wrote critical essays and were ridiculed as envious of others' good fortune. A poor painter created a satirical piece called "Blind Men Planting Flowers," depicting a crowd with blindfolds still rushing forward, clutching tulip bulbs like treasures. No one understood, no one wanted to understand, because everyone believed that if enough people went mad together, that madness would become the norm. And so, Holland, a land once renowned for its calmness and thrift, embarked on the most bizarre financial adventure in human history. From cities to villages, from rich to poor, all lived in the illusion that flowers could generate gold, and that belief could replace reality. When the winter of 1636 cast its misty shroud over Amsterdam's canals, the entire country of Holland was engulfed in the most dazzling madness in its history. No one cared about work, profession, or even reason anymore. Artisans abandoned their workshops, merchants their ships, lawyers, doctors, priests all talked about tulips. Every tavern, inn, and fair became an exchange floor where people bought and sold flower bulbs they had never seen, never bloomed, and sometimes not even planted. A new form of trading emerged: tulip futures contracts. Buyers didn't have to pay the full price. They only needed to place a small deposit and promise to pay when the flowers bloomed. Sellers didn't even need to deliver the goods, just a dated paper with a signature and a sworn promise of honor. From this, an economy based on promises was born, and each promise, when multiplied thousands of times, became a real storm. In crowded taverns, contracts were signed under dim lights, shouts echoed, people clinked glasses, laughing every time prices rose. A single bulb changed hands 5, 10, even 20 times a day. Each time it changed owners, the price increased by tens of florins. Everyone believed they were smarter than others, that by selling at the right moment, they would become millionaires. No one thought about what would happen if everyone wanted to sell at once. Someone recounted a strange story. A flower grower hid some precious tulip bulbs in his cellar and hired a housekeeper. The housekeeper, thinking they were edible onions, boiled them to eat with bread. When the truth was discovered, he was arrested and charged with destroying property worth an entire mansion. A flower bulb, originally just a fragile root of a plant, had now become a treasure that could send a man to prison. The fever spread like a plague. Everyone carried the belief that they would be the last lucky one. An old widow in Horn sold all her jewelry to buy 2 Semper Augustus bulbs, believing they were insurance for her old age. A shoemaker in Leiden abandoned his trade, using all his savings to buy tulip contracts, then hired others to buy more for him. They called it doubling opportunities. Newspapers, poetry, even the church were not spared from this whirlwind. Some preachers said that tulips were a gift from God, blessing the Dutch people with prosperity. On the streets, satirical paintings depicted monkeys dressed as nobles signing tulip contracts, smoking pipes, and counting money. But instead of making the populace sober, these paintings became a joke, because everyone thought they weren't the monkey in the painting, but the smarter one holding the pen. Prices rose so fast that people no longer measured them in florins, but in dream profits. A merchant boasted that in just 1 month he had increased his fortune tenfold thanks to tulips. A poor weaver, who once earned only a few florins a week, now paraded through the streets, boasting that he had a flower garden worth an entire fortune. The madness no longer differentiated classes, it turned everyone into equals in delusion. Tulip trading floors sprang up everywhere, from coffee houses and inns to aristocratic living rooms. They called them florin clubs. In crowded rooms, trembling hands signed documents, sparkling eyes gazed at signed papers. A nod could change a person's entire life. A rumor could enrich one person and ruin another. Belief became the new currency, and everyone was willing to buy and sell it with their souls. In January 1637, tulip prices reached their peak. A single Semper Augustus bulb was sold for 10,000 florins, equivalent to a canal-side mansion and a 4-horse carriage. It was said that in a single day, over 100 contracts were signed, and everyone leaving the tavern believed they were a financial genius. They raised their glasses in celebration, calling it the eternal flower season. No one knew that at that very moment of greatest brilliance, the storm of collapse had begun to form. An anonymous philosopher wrote in his diary, "I see the whole country like a tulip field, splendidly beautiful, but only waiting for a strong wind to shed its petals." He was right, for as soon as belief reached its climax, it began to melt away. One person failed to pay their contract on time, then a second, a third. Within days, fear spread faster than any plague. Those who had once cheered for buying flowers now silently looked at each other, and only the soft sound of imaginary petals falling could be heard, signaling the end of a season of madness. When frost still clung to the rooftops of Amsterdam, a small auction in Haarlem failed. No one bid on the tulip bulb for sale. That single silence, like a stone dropped into a lake, shattered the glittering illusion in which the entire country had mirrored itself for years. People still recount that in that moment, a merchant turned to his friend and said, "Perhaps flowers are no longer gold." And so, everything began to collapse. News spread faster than wind. Those who had once jostled to buy now jostled to sell, but no one was buying anymore. Prices plummeted, from thousands of florins down to a few hundred, then a few tens. Tulip contracts once signed with a promise of honor now turned into worthless paper. People brought them to court, demanding annulment, begging for their deposits back. But the judge shook his head, for in the eyes of the law, these were not commercial contracts but merely games of chance for fools. The cold storage rooms that once held precious tulip bulbs were now silent. Flower growers watched them rot day by day. No one bought, no one inquired. In the cities, merchants went bankrupt, families lost their homes. Those who had once been wealthy now had to work for the very people they had once scorned. Holland, a nation once proud of its reason and discipline, now bowed before its own lesson. A farmer recounted, "I once traded 3 cows for a flower bulb. Now I can't even trade that bulb for a loaf of bread." A wealthy wife who had once bought Semper Augustus now planted it in a corner of her garden, silently watching the flowers bloom then wither. She said, "At least I got to see it bloom once." That remark spread like a farewell to a shattered dream. Courts and governments intervened. They organized arbitration councils, allowing buyers to cancel contracts if they forfeited a 10% deposit. But it was too late. The entire system of transactions based on trust had broken down. People no longer trusted anyone, not promises, not gold, not even flowers. Some desperate individuals sought the river, throwing themselves into its cold waters. The press called them tulips on the canals, a painful image of a country just awakening. Meanwhile, ethicists and philosophers spoke out. They wrote that Tulipmania was a mirror to the human heart. When beauty is trapped on the scales of profit, it will wither before it can bloom. Many paintings were created to satirize the era. Monkeys in court, dressed as judges, holding tulip bulbs, smiling arrogantly. Beneath one painting was the inscription, "We laugh at the madmen of yesterday, but the madmen of tomorrow are us." An old merchant who was one of the first to sell tulips for thousands of florins was asked what he thought of it all. He replied, "I don't regret selling, I only regret believing." That remark spread like a collective confession of an entire nation. Belief, the only thing that gave value to those flower bulbs, had been crushed along with the land. The storm passed, leaving behind a gray sky. The fields that were once brilliant were now bare stumps and weeds. People returned to real work, real commerce, real money. But in their eyes, there was still a silent fear. Fear that greed would once again disguise itself as beauty and return one day. Mackay, in the final pages of this section, writes that, "There is nothing new under the sun. Men will go mad again, only under different names." And indeed, since the Tulipmania, the world has witnessed countless other fever stalks, gold, real estate each time wearing the face of hope and ending with the shattering sound of broken trust. In the afternoon in Harlem, people still grow tulips. No one buys or sells frantically anymore. Children play among the flower beds, old folks sip wine on their porches. The sunset casts its glow on the petals, making them more vibrant yet also more fragile. And in that breeze, the whisper of a mad era still seems to echo. The most beautiful flower is the one that has never been valued. There are times in history when people think they are entering an era of wisdom, but in reality, they are only fleeing from their own insecurity. Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds Asterisk is not a record of 3 financial fevers, but a mirror reflecting the collective nature of humanity. We always fear being alone in reason and seek solace in the madness of the crowd. John Law believed he could change an entire economy with belief. The English believed patriotism could justify greed, and the Dutch believed that beauty could create gold. But in the end, all those beliefs shattered like tulip petals in the wind. The lesson is not in the collapse of money, but in the fragility of belief when it detaches from truth. Humans only need a story compelling enough to pour their entire souls into it, until that story betrays them. Charles Mackay's book was not written for people of the 17th century, but for us, the people of the present, living amidst other illusions named innovation, financial freedom, technology liberating humanity. We are still reenacting Mississippi, South Sea, and Tulipmania in new forms. The only difference is that this time, illusion is disguised with terminology, charts, and promises from those smarter than its very creators. Every era has a rationalized frenzy. When something is chanted loudly enough, spread widely enough, it becomes truth, even if no one truly understands why. That is humanity's deepest instinct, the fear of being left behind. No one wants to be the only one to say no when the whole world is cheering. But sometimes, that tiny voice is the boundary between the sane and the mad. And perhaps the deepest lesson from this book is not, don't speculate, or don't trust the crowd, but rather, observe how people believe something. When someone tells you that everyone is doing it, stop. When a sure-win opportunity appears, remember, nothing spreads faster than delusion told in the language of reason. How many times in your life have you believed a story just because too many people believed it? How many decisions were made not because you wanted to, but because you were afraid of being different? And if you had to choose between sober solitude and an exhilarating collective frenzy, would you have the courage to choose the former? History does not repeat itself, but humans do. New fevers will come again, differing only in name, means, and speed of spread. But the essence remains the same: greed clothed in hope, fear wrapped in the language of progress. The only thing that can save us is not cleverness, but the ability to stop and observe. Perhaps true happiness does not lie in knowing sooner than others or winning the crowd's game, but in daring to stand outside it, daring to let your belief not need to be shared by millions. Because sometimes the most sober thing a human can do is accept being seen as mad. And if there is a concluding remark for this book, perhaps it is a gentle reminder: the crowd never learns anything, but each individual within it still has a chance. Choose to be that individual. Slow down before things that are being hyped. And when you hear someone say that the whole world is heading that way, smile and ask yourself, does that world truly know where it is going?